What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Dark Crisis. Again, Infinite Frontier as part of the Dark Crisis event. But what I want to do here, because this part, really what I'm going to tell you here in a second is going to be very, very important with regards to this discussion. And I know I have mentioned this before, but I do want to reiterate this just because of the nature of what we're going to be talking about here. The nature of Crisis on Infinite Earths and then Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis. As we talked about before, right, the original Crisis event, Crisis on Infinite Earths, that basically got rid of the multiverse. That Infinite Crisis brought it back, and Final Crisis made the heroes aware of it. But here's an important distinction to understand here, that when the multiverse returned during the events of Infinite Crisis, it was not the multiverse the way it existed before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, from a publishing perspective, DC did this because what it did is it allowed them to bring back the characters from the original multiverse, but basically modify their origins a little bit, or modify their characters a little bit, or something along those lines. It wasn't really DC saying like, the multiverse is back, just like it was before Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was basically DC saying, the multiverse is back, now let's tell our stories. And for years and years and years, this was not really a major talking point among the characters within DC Comics, with the exception of the few. Psycho Pirate is one of those, and this is an important thing here, because what he says is, the multiverse is real. You and I both know that, and yet those words made people on Earth Zero think I was nuts. They locked me up, threw me in Arkham for years. Instead of listening to me, helping me, they hid the truth. My world was the original Earth 2, the one before the first big crisis. When the multiverse was recreated, my Earth 2 no longer existed, replaced by a brand new fancy one. How do you think that made me feel? Now, of course, this is him talking, but this is one of the things that I want to explain here, right? He says, now you don't know what happened to me, what happened to you, do you? Your world deemed no longer necessary, a thing of the past. We've seen it happen again and again, right? Every time there is some crisis, someone gets hurt. So much heartbreak and horror, it's tragic. Then heroes of Earth Zero celebrate the win. But because of the restart, they don't even remember what they are missing. And you know it will happen. And you have to ask, is my world next? Now, Darkseid offered us a deal. If you follow my very simple instructions, Darkseid will guarantee your world is protected, away from that dangerous Earth Zero. But someday I will call on you to back me up. And when I call, you better come running. But hopefully everything goes according to plan, and it never comes to that, right? Now here's the importance of this opening statement by Psycho Pirate, because unless you're familiar with the multiverse, and really with a lot of what happened in DC on the multiversal level, this whole thing is lost on you. So again, reiterating here, where Infinite Crisis brought the multiverse back, what Psycho Pirate is saying here is that the version of Earth 2 that came back after the events of Infinite Crisis was not the original Earth 2 the way it was depicted in Flash of Two Worlds back in 1961 or 63 or whatever it was. It's not that version of Earth 2. Instead, it was a modified and reworked version of Earth 2 for the modern era. Psycho Pirate is one of the only characters in existence in all of DC Comics who not only came from an alternate reality before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, but remembers everything as it was before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. He never forgot. Now, let's tie Doomsday Clock into this, because I imagine a lot of people are kind of like, okay, so I thought Doomsday Clock fixed all of that. And it kind of did. And so the way that worked, right, to kind of tie all this together and gave you guys this bit of a story in terms of how things happened and what this story is doing to change it, is that if the original Crisis event killed the multiverse, Infinite Crisis brought it back, Final Crisis made the heroes aware of it, then the way Flashpoint was originally written, it was Barry Allen going back in time to save his mom's life. And in doing that, he inadvertently, like, totally reworked or restarted the entirety of the Earth Zero universe, basically the main DC universe. And so in order to ensure things go back to the way they were supposed to, in the original Flashpoint event, Barry went back and let his mom die. When he came back, what DC did is they used that as a way to basically consolidate all the different storytelling brands they had. So Wildstorm and Vertigo and all that stuff into the main DC universe. And that gave us the New 52 relaunch in 2011. Doomsday Clock came back and then modified that yet again by basically saying what had actually happened is everything had effectively gone back the way it was supposed to. But what Dr. Manhattan did is he prevented Jay Garrick from coming into existence. And with Jay Garrick basically no longer existing or having been killed in the train crash, then in turn, there was no JSA. And because there was no JSA, the Justice League, as it would traditionally form, didn't necessarily happen that way. That, along with a few other things, basically led to Manhattan removing memories or an entire history from the minds of DC superheroes. The nature of Doomsday Clock, Dr. Manhattan reversing those actions, as well as Death Metal recreating the multiverse or restructuring it, basically saw those memories returning back to the superheroes. But one of the things that I want to specify here is that the restoration of all those memories from before the New 52, right? The idea that they remembered their whole histories, all they really remembered was everything after the original Crisis on Infinite Earths event, going forward into like the New 52 and the relaunch and all that stuff. None of them remember anything from before the original Crisis. That's the important thing, and that's what's being said here, is that that original multiverse as it was existed, or at least as it existed, and as it was destroyed, only Psycho Pirate remembers. So that's really an important distinction to understand here. Having said all that, the way this does, or at least what this does, is it picks up on Earth Omega. Now remember, Earth Omega is a world that exists out there, and I've kind of waited up to this point to basically rehash this. If you guys recall our coverage of Infinite Frontier number 0, which DC launched shortly after the Death Metal event, that what that did is it told us that Earth Omega was a world that Darkseid was effectively imprisoned on. He was locked away by the Octessence. He ultimately destroyed them, and then whatever happened, happened. This is basically the follow-up to that. And so here on Earth Omega, this is where Darkseid reigns. It's where Darkseid rules basically everything. But there's also a much bigger force at play here than what we're initially being shown. And so of course you have Cameron Chase, who wakes up here on this world and of course ends up coming across Bones. Now of course this is basically Bones returning back to the villain that we knew, the old JSA, Alan Scott villain, and so on and so forth. So just kind of him going back to the way things used to be. Of course, Alan Scott and his son Obsidian have also arrived here on the scene to try to find their daughter Jade. Of course, they're reunited with Jade, so the family's kind of all here, basically wrapping up the plot thread of their story over the course of this. And one of the things that's talked about here is that because of the nature of Earth Omega, and because it is basically a prison planet that can't simply just be left on a whim, the only ways to leave this world are either by way of the ships that were used to get here, which are basically destroyed, or the Flash Barry Allen. Now the Flash, of course, can do this by vibrating from one universe to the next. The problem is they don't know of a Flash that can do that because Barry Allen's missing, only for them to realize that Barry Allen is there, but he's being used as a means to power a gigantic device that exists out there, very similar to the way he was used during the original Crisis event. And so this is one of those wild things, because in the midst of all this, suddenly you have Roy Harper who shows up here. Now, we are going to get an explanation of how it was that Roy Harper came back. It's going to be a little haphazard and just sort of thrown in there, but it serves its purpose. And in all honesty, we don't necessarily need a great big huge full-on explanation here. Instead, what you end up getting is Cameron Chase asking the question of Extract, right? Again, this person that works for Bones that's able to kind of jump in and jump out of different places, literally extract people from locations. That Cameron Chase asked the question, who are you and why are you here, right? You're like the thorn that's constantly been here in everybody's side, only for Extract to remove her helmet and reveal she's actually Cameron Chase, the original Cameron Chase from the original Earth 2 way back in the day before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And so it's kind of crazy that what you're basically getting here is these various individuals that are appearing from the original multiverse that existed before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So I hope you're kind of picking up what's going on here, that what we effectively have are two multiverses going on, because as you guys know, in a multiverse, there's only one Earth 2, right? There are worlds out there that are similar to Earth 2, but there's only one world that's actually named Earth 2, which means if this version of Cameron Chase does not come from the modified version of Earth 2 post-Crisis after the events of Infinite Crisis, then it means she has to come from the original, and that's what she says. The original version of Earth 2, but was erased during the original Crisis event, which begs the question, how in the world have these people returned if they come from a multiverse that technically doesn't exist anymore? Now again, before anybody actually gets any definitive questions answered here, what you end up getting is a fight that basically breaks out between the Injustice Incarnate that's basically led by Psycho Pirate, so basically these different alternate reality villains who exist out here, and the good guys is essentially all you really get. Now, one of the things to know is that it's not simply just these bad guys that are facing off against the superheroes. In fact, it's Earth Omega itself, that this prison planet is as much a kind of sentient place as anything else, because what you end up having are like these sort of chains that exist as part of this realm that are actually keeping the heroes locked in place. Now, you do get a really cool moment where you actually end up seeing Calvin, basically the President Superman, who essentially breaks free of his chains, very similar to like the old school Superman cover. Kind of a funny thing, and to sidetrack from the story for a second, for those of you guys who don't know the significance behind that story, one part of that significance is actually a misconception that was believed by fans at the time. And the second thing is the significance of it from a publishing perspective. So the cover is actually Superman issue number 233. But when DC published it, DC referred to it on the cover as #1 best-selling comics magazine. What people thought this was is a #1. They thought it was a reworking, like a relaunch of the Superman comics, which of course that was not necessarily the case. The other reason why this matters is because this is when Mort Weisinger had actually left Superman and Julius Schwartz had taken over. This is the infamous story where Superman fought the sand version of himself. He ultimately defeated him, but then DC drastically reduced his powers. So like he lost his weakness to kryptonite, but his powers were also slashed in half, different things along those lines. One of the most reviled runs on Superman in the history of the character. And so DC basically backpedaled on that pretty fast, and they tried to return him to the version that people most loved. The problem is that by the time that happened, he died in the early 1990s and his comics never recovered. Really until Rebirth, to be honest with you guys. The point is that you kind of get this bigger picture that's sort of assembled here. That Calvin has picked up on the fact that it was Machine Head who was part of the Multiversal Justice League team that had actually worked with Lex Luthor to perfect the technology to be able to work and to navigate the multiverse. And that's what Machine Head says, right? He says, you wanted unity for all of us to work together, for the multiverse to be one big happy family. But Psycho Pirate is right. Every time something bad happens in the multiverse, it happens because of Earth Zero, because of the main DC universe. Is it because they are special or because they are forever a ticking time bomb? Literally, every problem that happens in the multiverse happens because of them. And he says, you know what it was that Flash did. He traveled back in time to save his mother, and when he did, he caused cracks in Earth Zero's history, creating a new reality. And he says, did you know those cracks did not stop on Earth Zero? They splintered out into the multiverse. Now, one thing that is obviously missing here is any reference to Doomsday Clock and Dr. Manhattan. And it's almost as if this Infinite Frontier and Dark Crisis event is essentially ignoring it, right? Like it didn't happen, almost kind of undoing it all, or finding a way to basically circumvent Doomsday Clock to almost make it a sort of out of continuity story, and then craft a new story that essentially fills the place that would otherwise be left by Doomsday Clock to create a cohesive series or I guess a long-form crisis event. Because if we're being honest with ourselves, that's really what this is, right? This is almost like an 11-year-long crisis event. It started back in 2011 with the New 52, and it's just been running ever since, right? Like New 52 launched, it was a resounding success in the beginning, and then as time progressed and people realized all that history belonging to the characters was being wiped away, fans started to reject it. DC corrected that, or at least tried to correct it with a series of stories. It didn't quite work. Doomsday Clock and DC Rebirth fixed that, and then it's just been a series of crisis events ever since. So if we're being honest, ever since Flashpoint, we've just been reading a gigantic crisis story. It wasn't necessarily published that way, it wasn't marketed that way, and I would even argue initially it wasn't meant to be that way. But it wasn't until Rebirth happened that it became that way. So again, it's really kind of interesting, to see all this stuff sort of tying together and coming together. But really, like Machine Head reveals here that he's the one that killed Calvin's Lex Luthor, the one that we saw in the last video that had basically been beat to death, right? That Lex Luthor in that reality got scared, that he questioned what it was that they were doing. But he still told Machine Head the weakness of Calvin, which is Meta Knight, right? Like that version of kryptonite, the kryptonite from his own universe. And he says, and this remnant of a dead reality, this Thomas Wayne from Flashpoint, I sent for him. I wanted to torture that world, but it's gone. So I'll simply take my revenge out on him instead. But it's one of those things where they are all, for various reasons, banding together for the purpose of essentially either trying to destroy Earth Zero, or at the very least, serving Darkseid in such a capacity to where the original multiverse seemingly can be returned. Now, that's one of the important aspects of Darkseid himself. That one of the things to know is that with the restoration of the multiverse, all the different iterations of Darkseid that have ever been depicted or that have ever appeared in DC Comics have been reconciled into a singular being in terms of Darkseid as we know him now. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people are looking at this version of Darkseid and referring to him as True Form Darkseid. Now again, one of the things to point out, True Form Darkseid is not an actual in-continuity name for any version of Darkseid. It really is just something fans made up. They made made it up in order to reconcile the various depictions of Darkseid, but it's still just completely and totally made up by fans. And until such a time that DC comes along and refers to that version of Darkseid as true form Darkseid, that version of Darkseid does not actually exist in the comics, and it doesn't matter what anybody tells you. And so following that, you actually have this really interesting thing where, with all the other heroes having been defeated, it really comes down to Roy Harper and Psycho Pirate. And what Psycho Pirate reveals here is the whole reason why Roy Harper's back is he says, when the Batman Who Laughs transformed the world into his own image during the whole death metal event, that Batman from Earth Zero, the Bruce Wayne that we all know and love, that he used a black ring to resurrect the dead, which included Roy Harper. The big question to ask here is, why didn't Roy Harper die? And the answer given to him by Psycho Pirate is that Roy Harper has a history of letting the darkness inside of him, that Roy Harper knows pain and he knows isolation. Now, the reason why Psycho Pirate can actually make this claim is that it's much deeper than the idea of like Roy Harper having died and things along those lines. What Psycho Pirate's referencing here, because remember, he comes from the original multiverse, he's referencing the old Neil Adams and Dennis O'Neil run of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, right? This story, Snowbirds Don't Fly, when Roy Harper was known as Speedy and he was on drugs, that kind of a thing, right? He's like literally, Psycho Pirate remembers all that stuff. So he's referencing those super old school events that happened in the life of Roy Harper that in a lot of ways, he'd just been made to forget. It's why you see drugs there, it's why you see his daughter there, different things like that. It's referencing all that old school stuff. But what he says here is that when the multiverse was recreated, just like how Jordan's ring looked for the fearless, the ring that Roy Harper has looked for someone who has suffered. And he says, you can become its new avatar, just let yourself go. Now, Roy Harper responds and says that you say this is some great weapon, that I can use this ring to save everyone here. And this is a really interesting caveat that's given by Psycho Pirate. It's why it is, this guy is a lot smarter than he seems. He says, yes, you can, but you know what happens, don't you, right? You turn into a zombie. That ring will take you over. It'll turn you into a mindless creature of the dark. It'll take away all your pain and suffering, and it will erase all that you once knew. I will offer you the same deal I offered Bones. If you help me now, we will leave Earth Zero alone. Your daughter will be safe. And that's when Roy Harper realizes his daughter is not here on Earth Omega, that she's actually back on Earth Zero. But his daughter is alive. The hallucinations that he thought he was experiencing by way of the ring are not hallucinations, but tangible views, right? Tangible visions. And so that's when he ultimately makes this sacrifice and says, okay, like if what this means is I have to sacrifice everything I am in order to save the life of my daughter and in order to save my friends, that's exactly what I will do. And Roy Harper sacrifices his life, and in doing so basically like spawns all these different organisms and monsters and constructs from this ring that he has, and literally they all just go and like free all these individual superheroes that are out there. But in the process, Roy Harper starts to lose himself. He basically starts turning into a tried and true Black Lantern, and that's when Psycho Pirate says, you really don't know what it is that you've done here. You really have no clue what it is that you've just unleashed. And so where the Justice Incarnate and like the JSA and like all these groups start banding together, that when Calvin shows up and says, you're done, Psycho Pirate, there's a kind of disembodied voice that comes out of nowhere and says, it's too late. And any battle now will only feed my power. The multiversal barriers have been created and all of its citizens will kneel to me. And with my Omega Lantern at my side, I control all. That this is the return of Darkseid. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Like I said, Infinite Frontier is amazing. It's absolutely great. But we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.